Thanks to everyone coming into the session. I'm Sam Sussman from Extend. For those of you who are not familiar with Extend, Extend works to transform the conversation on Israel-Palestine by introducing American audiences to Palestinian and Israeli leaders in civil society, academia, media, and human rights advocacy. You can learn more about Extend at extendprograms.org. Follow us on Facebook and on Twitter, which we just launched yesterday. That's at Extend Programs. So we're looking forward to a great conversation that includes your questions coming from the audience. Please send them into the Q&A box and we'll make sure that everyone has a chance to be part of the conversation. So let's get to it. Over the last months, as everyone is aware, there have been protests outside Prime Minister Netanyahu's Balfour residence. They've grown into some of the largest in recent Israeli history, but they've also been described in very different terms. So we're here today to discuss what these protests represent and what possibilities they offer for Israel's embattled left, and importantly for this conversation, for a sense of an expansive, inclusive left. So we're lucky to have with us for this conversation three fresh and engaging voices who, if you're not following their work already, you should be. So Orly Noy is an editor at Local Call, a political activist, a translator of Farsi poetry and prose. She's a member of B'Tselem's executive board and an activist with the Balad political party. Her writing deals with the lines that intersect and define her identity as Mizrahi, a female leftist, and a woman. Gilad Halpern is a journalist, broadcaster, and media historian. He's the co-host of the Tel Aviv Review, a founding co-editor of the Tel Aviv Review of Books magazine, and an Idit Fellow at the University of Haifa. His work has appeared on the BBC, Al Jazeera, Al Monitor, Time Out, Jewish Quarterly, and the Jewish Chronicle. And Yasser Abu Arisha is a journalist, social activist, and Arabic teacher. He's a blogger at Sika Mekonit and an editor at Haaretz. His writing deals with the identity and rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. So first, thanks to the three of you for joining us. Great. So let's start with this, a question for each of you. People see and describe, I think like all of us, I've been reading a lot of reports of what's been going on in Jerusalem, and people see and describe very different things. A stale protest narrowly focused on anyone but Bibi, a slightly broader movement, but one still limited to middle-class Jewish Israelis, or a movement pushing the conversation at least a little bit on gender violence, police brutality, and occupation, with some reports of protesters drawing comparison to Black Lives Matter and chanting the name of Iyad al-Halik, the young Palestinian man shot dead by border police in May. So three very different senses of what these protest movements are about. So I want to start with this. What do you each see when you look at these protests? And let's start with Orly.
Well, actually, a little bit of each. I mean, from the get-go, I think that this protest received a lot of criticism for having a one message, which is, as you mentioned, anything but Bibi, and for not being focused enough in its demands. But I think that with time, those points turned out to be exactly its strongest points, actually. I mean, the fact that the protest does not have one strict, rigid leadership actually allowed a lot of different voices and power to take part of in it and to express different agendas. And gradually, the Just Not Netanyahu started receiving a more interesting content and meaning. I mean, Not Netanyahu became not just no to corruption, but also no to occupation, no to police violence, no to gender violence, no to environmental corruption, etc. In other words, gradually, and even without meaning, I mean, without intention, this protest turns out to go against something much broader than Netanyahu, specifically the person itself. Maybe because I think after, being so many years in power, the power itself, not the government, but the governing if you will, became so much identified with Netanyahu, the person, that going against Netanyahu or protesting against Netanyahu became, in a way, protesting against the system. And this is something very important, I think, in Israel right now, because it somehow connects the different protests against the different sorts of injustice in the entire, by the way, territory between the Jordan River and the sea. Having said that, I think that it is true that the weakest point of the protest at this point is not proposing an appealing enough alternative to Netanyahu. Now, I'm not even sure that this is necessarily the job of the protest to do so, but it is obvious that as long as we don't have a solid alternative to Netanyahu, and by a solid alternative, I mean not yet another Jewish, Ashkenazi, nationalist, militaristic male, one that supports Jewish supremacy, etc. I think that the limits or the prospects of that protest will remain somehow limited.
Thanks for getting us off to such a good start with that description, and we'll come back to a few of those topics. Gilad, what do you see when you look at these protests?
Yeah, as Oli said, I absolutely agree. It's a bit of everything, and I think that that's at the same time its weakness and its strength, because popular revolt or any kind of protest often relies on the creation of unlikely coalitions. And this is, I think, the only way things can move forward. And in that sense, I think that it's, you know, it seems maybe it's too early to say with confidence, but it seems promising in this respect that we see really a motley crew of very unlikely mix of messages, of people, of activists, of movements coming together under more or less the same banner at the same time, calling for more or less the same thing. The problem is that this is so unusual for Israel. I mean, it's not unusual at all for any sort of democracy, but for Israel, it's so unusual because politics in this country is so compartmentalized. And we've seen it very well over the last couple of years with 3 election campaigns that changed very little. I can't remember which international journalist it was that tweeted after the 2nd or 3rd election last year, a delegation is now searching for the Israeli swing voter, because people very, very often change the voter or even their camp. So therefore, I mean, and it's not a coincidence, I think, that these protests erupted after the political deadlock has proved so it's impossible to resolve, because people went to the polls 3 times within the span of just over a year, or even less than a year, trying to change things and move things forward, and have failed. And therefore, it's kind of trickled down to the more popular level, and this is what we're seeing now. How it will play out, it's, as I said, it's too early to tell, especially because, as I said, politics is so compartmentalized, and people are unlikely to change their views when things do matter, and that is in the polling booth. And as you see, the reaction of Netanyahu and his cronies has been to whip up these entrenched divisions within Israeli politics, right? Showing a picture of Ayman Odeh, the leader of the Joint List, just marching outside Balfour, outside the Prime Minister's residence, as if it's some sort of a crime, or rather than just a politician and a community leader expressing a very, very basic civil right. There is a sense of change. I think, you know, there's the atmosphere, especially on Saturday night there in Jerusalem, outside the Prime Minister's residence, is very special. I've been to many protests and demonstrations in this country over the years, and it feels different. What does that mean in practice? I don't know. If we remember, and we do remember, the 2011 protests, that also felt different and felt magical, and the numbers have been were extraordinary, even more impressive than they are now, and the messages were a lot more focused than they are now, and the messages were also more appealing to a larger demographic, right? Who, you know, back then it was the cost of living, right? You know, something anyone can connect to. Right now, it's something more about, you know, norms of governance and corruption and things that are, you know, more in the eyes of the beholder than just, you know, in your bank account at the end of every month. So it's really hard to make, as we say, as they say, it's really hard to make predictions, especially when the future is concerned.
Gilad, thanks for that. And I think we're going to shortly get into some of those complexities of compartmentalization. And I like this phrase, unlikely coalitions. I think we're going to come back to this concept. Yasser, what do you see when you look at these protests?
Well, good evening, everybody, again. What I see actually is every week, thousands of brave men, women, children who say silence no more, let's say, about what's happening in the country for many reasons, as my friend Orly and my friend Gilad said before. It's about many things. It's about police brutality. It's about Benjamin Netanyahu. It's about all the economical problems and all the lack of management that we have in many aspects and in many fields in the country, about our money that we pay our taxes and we get nothing in front of what we give. So this is what I see. But in all this story about a very important protest, there is one thing is missing for me, that is more Palestinians joining these protests. It's not happening. It's not happening, and there are many reasons. The Arab society, the Palestinian society in Israel has its own problems that are being abandoned and not dealt with for decades over decades since the establishment of the state. We are talking about the period of the military regime on the Palestinians of Israel. It's a very long, sad era of our history that makes the Palestinian society all the time stay behind and with low resources and low and no possibilities and no equal possibilities in many terms. And the things and the drive that people in Balfour have, the Palestinian people doesn't have it, does not have it, don't have it. So this is what I see generally. I like that my friend Gilad is optimistic. I want to be optimistic also. I am pessimistic for the short term and very optimistic for the long term. because I don't believe in direct results and immediate results. I believe in process, and I believe that moreover, and in addition to what's happening in Balfour, civil movement should be working also on the people in the same time for thinking about the long term, what will happen in the day after, and not only to think about that we get rid now of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud and we bring something new, we try our tools again. We should think a little bit more for the, I don't know, 20, 30 years from now, what will really happen? And there are like big problems that we need to deal with. The problems of the, all the global warming and the waste that we make as humans and that we destroy our earth. So we should be thinking also like the new age is thinking, the young people, the children of the TikTok. What do they think now? What's in their minds? We should think like them, because what we do now is for them, not only for us. So this is what I see. I hope I didn't talk too much. I talk too much sometimes. So
not at all. Yes, I actually want to stay with you for a moment because in writing about why Palestinian citizens of Israel haven't participated, you had a great line. You wrote that with COVID and corruption, quote, who has time to talk about civic equality and human rights? And I'd love the audience to hear from you in specificity. What are the needs and rights of Palestinian citizens in Israel that you feel are not being addressed either by the protests or the government?
Okay, well, it's a big question because you don't really know where to begin. Should we begin in the education system, that the Arab child is being given a budget that is lower, almost 5 times only, less, something like this, than other children in the country? So this is one important thing about education. Health system, like now there is a system of, in the coronavirus era now, in the time, that there's a system of red cities and green cities, and red cities will go under lockdown if something happens, and green cities can go to cinema and everything is okay. So now there are something like 24 cities in Israel that are red. The vast majority of them is Arabs and Jewish Orthodox. Two sectors, two societies that really suffer a little bit. Well, I can say that I can maybe, let's say, it's not equal, like, but both publics are suffering from this. So it's about health, it's about education, it's about equality in front of the law. Like, you know, the nation, what's the name of the law? Orly, help me please. State nation law. State nation law. The state nation law, it's a very bad law. It's a very bad law that, in a very rude way, excuse me for the word, it's like, in a very rude way, excludes the Arab citizens from being equal. You like say it in your words. It's like it's written. It's very it's like, I think it's shameful in some way for a state that says that it's really, it treats its citizens equally, but you don't, you say something and you make in the legislation something else. It's not a way to build together a collaborative life and to think together on the future. Our lives are very connected in the daily life. Jewish people and Palestinian people, we work together, we study together, we eat together in the same places, we go to have fun in the same places, we have some similarities in our cultures, in the people, and it's it's very normal to live a civil life that we find a way to try to find a way to live in a collaborative way and not to be separated all the time by fences and by laws and by whatever. We should think a little bit for the far period of time.
Right. Thanks for walking us through that. And I want to go to Orly to talk about another community that has an important part in this conversation. So Orly, you've been writing about the way in which Netanyahu and his allies have appealed to Mizrahi resentment to undercut the protest movement. So this is a little complicated. We have an old guard Ashkenazi prime minister painting his opponents as Ashkenazi elite, while inciting Mizrahim against protesters, despite his own racially charged language towards Mizrahim. So it's a little complicated, and for those who aren't perfectly fluent, or even for those who are, can you walk us through a little bit both what's going on here, and also maybe a little bit what's the same question as the Yasser's. What would it look like for the Mizrahi community to be more welcome or engaged with these sorts of protests, and what's missing? What's the discourse that's missing and preventing that?
Okay, so I assume that everybody knows what we are talking about when we say Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. Is that, or does that need clarification also?
It's fair to assume, but let's take a moment and clarify.
Okay, I mean, to put it very shortly, Ashkenazim are Jews who immigrated to Israel from European Western countries, and Mizrahim are Jews who immigrated to Israel from Muslim and Arab countries. That's and it really takes an entire semester in Israeli sociology to clarify that issue, but I'll try to sum it up. I mean, one of the main ways in which Netanyahu and his supporters, mainly in the Israeli media, have been trying to delegitimize that protest is to portray it as a struggle between what they call First Israel, which is the Ashkenazi elite, against the Second Israel, which is, in other words, the Mizrahim. Now, like any good manipulation, that claim recognizes, I mean, it recognizes a seed of truth, but then it takes it and twists it in a completely manipulative way to serve its own agenda. Now, why there is a seed of truth to that? Because there is, in fact, a First Israel, which is very much Ashkenazi, and there is the Mizrahi Second in Israel. And by the way, there are also Third Israel and Fourth Israel and Fifth Israel. I mean, if we're talking about Ethiopians, asylum seekers, of course, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, etc. And it is also true that the camp of the supporters of Netanyahu is very much identified with the Mizrahi population. So what is the manipulation here then? Is trying to the attempt to identify between Netanyahu himself and that Second Israel. I mean, trying to say that he really does represent the interest of the Mizrahim in any way. Now, I won't go into all the reasons for which Mizrahim traditionally support the Likud party. I mean, there is, just to mention a few very, very briefly, there is the historic and very much justified resentment towards the old Ashkenazi establishment of Mapai, who brought the Mizrahi communities into Israel in the 50s and dealt with them just horribly. There is the specific shape of patriotism that was imposed upon the Mizrahim, which is very much anti-Arab in its nature, because they were expected to distance themselves from the other Arabs around us, the Palestinians and our surrounding countries. And there are also some economic incentives that Mizrahis enjoyed in the settlements in the West Bank. But to portray Netanyahu, who is an Ashkenazi guy from the heart of the same Ashkenazi elite, is just ludicrous. Now, it becomes even more manipulative when we take into consideration the deep contempt that Netanyahu himself, every single member of his family and his immediate surrounding displayed towards the Mizrahim over and over again. I mean, just to mention a few, when his wife said to their Mizrahi housekeeper, "We are gentle Europeans, not like barbarians like you, the Moroccans." Or when Netanyahu himself, once making a hasty mistake, said that his Mizrahi gene acted out. And there are plenty of other examples. So, but I think that the main difference between the old Ashkenazi elite of Mapai and the current Ashkenazi elite, which is Netanyahu, is that while Mapai and the old Ashkenazi so-called lefty elite saw the Mizrahim as barbarians and excluded them as such, the new Ashkenazi elite, i.e. Netanyahu and his surrounding, continued seeing the Mizrahim as barbarians, but embraced them as such and gave them a role as the house barbarians. And that was sort of unfolded, that strategy in all its horrifying glory, when one of the closest people to Netanyahu, Natan Eshel, actually unfolded that strategy in a conversation that was recorded without him knowing. And he was recorded saying, the Mizrahim respond very well to hatred, to hate campaigns, and they can be incited very easily. And that's exactly what they're trying to do now, after every other attempt to delegitimize the protest failed. Now, to your question, so what can be done about it, or what the left can do about, trying to bridge that gap between the left camp and the Mizrahi audience? It would sound trivial, almost funny, but I think that the first thing it would be to stop the condescension and the racism. I mean, I'm engaged in so many, discussions between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and in every single one of them, really without exception, you can see different levels of racism by Ashkenazi leftists towards the Mizrahim as barbarians, as cultureless, educationless, etc., who should be grateful to the Ashkenazim for, building a country for them, or whatever. One other thing that is very common in this discussion is the denial. I mean, you would often hear Ashkenazim saying, "Oh, that was a thing of the 50s and it's long over now." This is while, after more than 70 years, the Mizrahim are still very close to the bottom of any scale that you will measure in the Israeli sphere. So stop denying the institutionalized discrimination against the Mizrahim would be also a good advice. To speak explicitly about discrimination, racism, and to acknowledge the part that the left itself had historically and currently in that discrimination. And the third thing would be to take an active part in Mizrahi struggles. I mean, the left should be an integral part of the struggle of the families of the kidnapped Yemenite kids. I won't go into details what that is, but these families have been struggling for decades to expose the truth, and the left is somehow just oblivious to that struggle. And that's the good case. In the worst case, they are actually denying that crime. The left should lead the struggle for a more just distribution of resources, of land, of the boundaries of the municipalities, which is a huge thing in Israel and affects both Palestinian citizens and Mizrahis directly. I think that the left should include explicitly in its agenda the struggle against the erasing and marginalization of the Mizrahi culture, for example, not just the Palestinian. So I would say that the three elements are recognition, remorse, and action.
Orly, thanks for such a comprehensive answer there and giving our audience so much to think through. I want to ask Gilad how you see these developments impacting the electoral map. We're talking about a sort of realignment or ways of thinking about realignment amongst various communities, but I'm curious, you've been tweeting a little bit about the sort of party element here. So you had an interesting tweet where you said, these demonstrations are actually as much against Gantz as they are against Bibi. And I'm curious how you see, we've been talking about alternatives. What would it look like to have a different sort of political alternative? And what do you think the possibilities for that are? How are the protests affecting that?
Yeah, well, I tweeted that thing you quoted, that they are against Gantz just as much as they're against Netanyahu. Because it was at a time just when they started, or maybe shortly after, that Gantz was interviewed in the media about the protests and very reservedly reacted to it and didn't say anything to throw his weight behind them in any way, shape, or form. And many of his disgruntled former voters and supporters said, "Why isn't he saying anything? You know, we are the people. You know, just." Few months ago, he was raising this banner so high. What happened? And that's exactly what happened. The problem is that Gantz is the one who failed and discouraged his voters, not Netanyahu. And if you look at it, many of the protesters are hopeful that the protests will be amplified to the point that Netanyahu would not be able to ignore them anyway, you know, similar to, you know, the Arab Spring protests that brought down Hosni Mubarak, for example, right? Hosni Mubarak was there to stay forever. And then, lo and behold, you know, millions of Egyptians flood the streets and he just, you know, wasn't capable of fending them off anymore. And I think that many of the protesters are still you know, have this sort of scenario in mind, and I'm sorry to fail them because, because I don't see any scenario where this is happening, because Netanyahu is really oblivious to any kind of democratic norm. I mean, if he cared anything about democratic norms, he would resign the minute he was indicted of very, very severe corruption charges. And if he didn't care about that, why would he care about several tens of thousands of people making lots of noise outside his residence? So I think I'm still convinced, and so is Netanyahu, sadly, and that the only way a significant change could take place is still in the political landscape, and you know, when it comes to party politics. And I say that with regret, and Netanyahu says it with much hope, because we both think, as Orly said in the beginning of this webinar, that there has been no valid and viable alternative to Netanyahu ever, actually. If you look at him as a politician, as a leader, as a statesman, you know, he's often touted in the Israeli media as a magician, right? Always landing on his feet as if he was a cat of some sort. And I think I won't go into it, but his mismanagement of the COVID crisis only proves what a lousy leader and statesman he is, only benefiting from the complete and utter incompetence of his rivals. And that he proved able to undo any sort of challenge very effectively. But, you know, what's beyond that is, you know, that's the only thing he knows how to do, right? Stymie his opponents and win an election. After that, God is great. Anyway, the problem is, when it comes to party politics, that for a very brief moment in 2019, it seemed like all the anti-Netanyahu, you know, I use it as in shorthand because, as Orly said, it's more complicated than that, but all the forces seeking to oust Netanyahu, for whatever reason it is, were coming together and dedicated to this purpose and this purpose only. And then just when it seemed like it was actually going to happen, because if you look at the last three elections that took place in 2019 and early 2020, Netanyahu never got a majority in any of them. And even in the last one, the current Knesset, he has a minority. The problem lies with very few right-wing politicians that somehow infiltrated the center-left for whatever reason that was. We can argue on that, and we do quite extensively. But that's exactly, you know, these 2 or 3 votes that are able to sustain Netanyahu's government at the moment are those that preventing his ouster. And that is only because they betrayed the campaign messages. I mean, it has to be said clearly that a majority of Israelis voted against Netanyahu, and not just against Netanyahu, but 4 parties that made it unequivocally clear that Netanyahu's departure is the #1 goal in their politics, and backtracked on these campaign pledges and promises. Now, on the one hand, we are definitely not, it's really not unusual that politicians backtrack on their election promises, and especially those on the left of center here in Israel. On the other hand, it came as such a shock to so many of them who felt really that Netanyahu's ouster was really within reach. And I think that over time, it's going to have a chilling effect on people voting or wanting to see political change in this country. It's really depoliticizing them, in the sense that they really stop believing in the power of politics, because, you know, we came so close, and if it didn't happen now, it probably won't happen ever. On the other hand, there's some realignment within the left, and I'm talking primarily about the disappearance of the Labour Party. That, you know, there was really a death by 1,000 cuts over the last 20 years or so. But it managed to sustain some sort of basis for support. And I was of the opinion that at some point Labour would re-emerge, because it is, after all, the centerpiece of the center-left in Israel. Every country, every democracy needs a center-left party, and Labour, with all its countless flaws, provided for that, you know, institutionally, mainly. But now it seems like, unless there's some sort of miracle, that it's gone for good. And I also think that, sorry, so just to finish on that point, it allows the center-left, predominantly Meretz and other parties, or one party to the left of it, to maintain, or maybe to define themselves as a clearly and unequivocally left-wing voice, you know, sharpening their messages of social justice, peace vis-a-vis the Palestinians, equality, civic equality within Israel, and other messages that were kind of watered down because for all sorts of electoral reasons, mainly trying to compete with the more centrist parties that really occupied the same historic place that Labour and the left of center Zionist camp in the political landscape occupied throughout the years. So now that there are fewer parties to fight over that very crowded, you know, there are more parties than voters probably, or just. So that's gonna help them, I think. The problem is what happens to the other more centrist voters who are, as I said, really disencouraged by the betrayal of the leaders. And I don't see, I join Orly's and Yasser's hopes in seeing someone who's really not that cookie cutter sort of general white Ashkenazi Zionist male singing the same songs and dancing the same dances. But I really don't see that happening anytime soon. The only hope that I can get is maybe for once that these people who do have, as I said, a majority in parliament and a majority within the electorate, seeing that really this is a to be or not to be sort of emergency moment, that I mean, what the current so-called unity government has proved to anyone who wasn't aware of that before, the very few people who weren't aware of that before, that any sort of deal with Netanyahu is not worth, you know, the paper it was written on. And the only way to rid Israel of Netanyahu is actually insisting on his departure. And one last thing I'd say, that it was alluded to here earlier, that it seems somewhat enticing to think that once Netanyahu is gone, everything will go back to normal. And, you know, things will be better, and Israel will be a thriving democracy again, and the occupation will end, and, you know, the Supreme Court will rule supreme and all that jazz. It's probably not going to happen, but it's worth bearing in mind that for a very, you know, with a very pragmatic view in mind, that Netanyahu's departure is probably the first step towards change. That really change is impossible as long as Netanyahu is here. And I think that I have to say in praise of the joint list that they've been saying that. They've been promoting that pragmatic message time and time again, saying Netanyahu's departure is the first step towards change. And I think that it's still trickling down to the electorate and to the parties, but because they are in such disarray, it's really hard to see how it will play out.
Great. So let's get Yasser in on this question. So I'm curious. You were talking before in very inspiring terms about coalitions between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis. I'm curious, what do you see as the electoral instruments of that? There's been some conversation in the last election about a possible merger between the joint list and Meretz. It didn't happen. Meretz merged instead with a Jewish party to its right. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that sort of electoral coalition? And then Orly, we're going to go to you with the same question.
That this kind of future should be after recognizing the possibility of building a state that is a civil state, not a Jewish state, and democratic, Jewish and democratic. This is a thing that really is a barrier that we should think, or people should think, what is the tools and what can we do peacefully, for sure, and in a democratic ways and civil ways on how to change. Because if you look around places that have successful democracies, they are civil democracies. They are not categorized for a special part of the people who are in the state. So this is the big question. And about the future, I think it depends on currents that move between the people. Okay, in every place there are messengers, I say, especially in this period of time. Many people are changing the way they are talking. Things are. I can see some spots that can say there could happen a change. Okay, especially, and I will continue what my friend Orly began before. The Mizrahi issue. It's a big question. Okay, I don't know how our audience are familiar with the history of the beginnings of the people who came from North Africa, Islamic and Arab countries in the 50s, and what was the process that they have passed in front of the authorities. But it was, let's say it in one word, it was almost not different from how the state treated the Arabs at the same time. Between 48 and 66, just I will give a little sentence about this thing. After the ceasefire and the establishment of the State of Israel, something like 150 to 200,000 Palestinians stayed inside the borders of Israel. That is my family. And we are citizens of the state. We are like not wanted citizens, but we are citizens. We have the ID, we have the great Israeli passport, but we are not equal. Okay, so between 48 and 66, we were under lockdown, like the lockdown that you have now, we all had or that we have it now in Gaza, let's say, we have it for 18 years. We could not get good education. We did not have the movement possibilities and work possibilities, infrastructure possibilities. Like my village was connected to some kind of treating the water that is not clean to treat it. Was only connected to this thing in 1993. So just imagine what's the difference, what's the gap. On the other hand, the Mizrahi people that suffered also from the state. We had some in the 70s and in the 60s, the Black Panthers, a Black Panthers movement that began in Haifa, who were protesting against the mistreating of the state for the Mizrahi people and the inequality. Until today, they are still big symbol of these times, the Black Panthers. And in the same time, these two groups were separated by the state, treating these people like this, treating these people like this, and giving lands and money to the people that are more wanted to be in the state. So now we understand that these two groups have some similarities in the way they think about the state. So there is a very, very interesting protest that began 5 years ago. It was small, but now it is the thing that people talk about in Israel, in addition to Balfour. It is about a small valley that crosses a kibbutz in northern Israel. And this valley, in order to go to the valley, that is like a natural resource that should be open to the public, you should pass from a gate, the gate of the kibbutz. And the people of the kibbutz, they don't want to open the gate to the people. So this made like kind of a protest between the people of the kibbutz and a group of youngsters from the area who mostly came from Mizrahi families. Not only, but mostly. Okay, from a city called Beit Shan or Bisan, that was a Palestinian town there. And this was the clash about a natural resource. But then this talking began something bigger. People started talking about the inequality between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi people. But although the talk is kind of inside the Jewish society, but I can feel that there is a kind of a sense of change in the speech, that even these people who are Mizrahi, who are colored as right-wing people, racist, not really racist, who are Benjamin Netanyahu supporters, they say, we want to see also Palestinians joining us in this protest. So you don't understand what's happening. But what's happening is that there is a change in the talk that happens in the infra talk. Okay, people are changing. Like, let's say, messengers can be organizations who really work on this or make the connections at least, like the Mizrahi Democratic movement, what it's called, only you tell me. Mizrahi.
Democratic Mizrahi Rainbow.
Yes, the Democratic Mizrahi Rainbow. This organization, it has some changes. It was something a little bit radical maybe in the past. Now it's a little bit changed, some more moderate thinking, a little bit more pragmatic. but they are also participating, they are giving their word, they are giving their understanding, their academic, their research, their thinking, they are bringing this to the people. So people get the knowledge and then they ask questions. Now you are in the coronavirus, you don't travel, you don't go to parties. You think, you learn, you read. Okay, so this is what's happening. So about collaboration, I think that it will be between people who suffered from the state and now rethink. It will happen a little bit slowly in the Arab society, a little bit rapidly in the Jewish community, but I think that in some stage, these two societies will meet and then things will change.
Thank you, Yasser. Orly, same question for you. I know that you're active with Balad. What's your vision for the way in which these changes can move through the streets to electoral change?
So to answer that, I will follow up on what both Yasser and Gilad said. I do share some of Yasser's optimism, not as much though, I'm afraid, but to get to that, I want to comment on something that Gilad said. I think it's absolutely true that Netanyahu remained in power also because of the incompetence of his rivals and the failure to present an attractive enough alternative, and also because the right-wing Trojan horses that penetrated the left and then committed that sabotage. That's true. But I think that the deeper and more significant reason because of which Netanyahu is still in power is, in one word, racism, or the fruit of the ongoing delegitimization of Palestinian politics and politicians in Israel, and the incitement against Palestinian politics, mostly by Netanyahu himself, but not only, also by so-called Zionist left for many years, that it made it impossible to collaborate with the joint list to get rid of Netanyahu. Because if they had the ability, if they were able to collaborate with joint list, not even as part of the government itself, just to support the withdrawal of just supporting the non-Netanyahu government from the Knesset, not from the government itself, it would have been done. And the joint list at some point was willing to do that. But the deep delegitimization of Palestinian politics made it impossible even for Zionist left to go there. So this is the main reason why Netanyahu is still in power. Now, which brings me to the optimistic part. I agree with Gilad that Netanyahu is probably not that impressed with tens of thousands of people protesting against him, although I do think that he's worried probably more than we think. I don't think he enjoys those views from his window in Balfour Street every week and few times a week sometimes. But he will not go down because people are protesting. There is no doubt. What is optimistic, and I think that the true meaning of these demonstrations, the thing that is happening there is the Israeli public exercising their democratic civic muscles, which have been underused for so long that they almost went out of, they became numb. And we are collectively beginning to sense those democratic civic muscles once again. And that has great potential, but I think for a long run, and the undermining democracy in Israel has been going on for such a long time, and we've actually never had a truly functioning democracy here that it's not about, the next elections or those after them. But you do see when Ayman Odeh today comes to the protest, he's received very well by people who are not necessarily voters of the joint list, not even Meretz. When Ofer Kassif, the Jewish member of the joint list, stands on the podium in the protest and speaks bluntly against the occupation, against the crimes against humanity that Israel commits in the occupied territories, people actually clap. It's something really unprecedented, I think, in Israel. What should be the translation, the political or the partisan translation of these developments? I certainly hope that nothing on the lines of breaking up the joint list to form a new sort of alliance between the more moderate, let's say, components of the joint list and Meretz. And we're speaking about Hadash, yeah, those. That's really the only option. Meretz will not go with the Islamic movement, nor with Balad. So we're speaking about Hadash. And I think that would be no less than a tragedy if that happened, because I think that the joint list is a historic achievement, not only for the Palestinian citizens, but for Israeli politics. And I think that to break it down now that it's starting to gain the legitimacy and the recognition that no political change in Israel can actually be achieved without the participation of the joint list would be just such a waste of the outcome of that protest. So I think, and I hope that the two, which for me would be the most significant outcomes of this protest, would be one, to convince more democratic Jews, Israeli Jews, to vote for the joint list as the only, really the only democratic alternative in Israeli politics right now. And the other thing is to legitimize the joint list in such a way that they will be able to fulfill their potential in throwing down Netanyahu eventually.
Right. Thanks, Orly. I want to get some questions from the audience in. We have a few great questions coming in. First one for Orly. Howard Horowitz, who's an activist in New York, says there's been increasing and positive talk of alliances between Mizrahi and Palestinian communities, even on bread and butter issues. What are the prospects? Are there any real developments towards this? Orly, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I wish, but I want to remain realistic and say that I don't see it happening I mean, I'm not as optimistic as Yasser, I'm afraid, about that issue for two reasons. First is that the only institutionalized Mizrahi politics in partisan terms that we have today is Shas. And what happened to Shas, if you look at Shas of 1992, and you look at the Shas of today, you will see the entire Mizrahi tragedy, which is going deeper and deeper into the arms of the far right, sometimes fascist right. By the way, as the entire Israeli politics went more and more to the right, it's not just the Mizrahi. But you don't have an institutionalized partisan Mizrahi political presence on the Israeli political map other than Shas, and Shas is no option in the foreseeable future for cooperation with the Palestinians. So that's one reason. And also, if we are talking about cooperations on the ground or on the grassroots level, even there, I think it's more complicated and not as optimistic as Yasser very beautifully put it. There are, I agree that in the struggle that Yasser mentioned, there is some cooperation. It's very, very minor. We should admit, Yasser, I think you're the only Palestinian that I know that is actually taking part of that protest. So I'm not sure. Maybe there are a few others, but it's not a Palestinian Mizrahi thing
Not
yet.
about the number only.
But it's also about numbers, and even if it were, I mean, it's I think that the the notion of Jewish supremacy is still the organizing logic of Jewish politics in Israel, no less among Ashkenazim than Mizrahim, but certainly among the Mizrahim. And I don't think that the prospects of cooperation or what can be gained from that cooperation with Palestinians surpasses the Jewish supremacy sentiments. And I'm saying it, it's a tragedy. I see it, I say it very, very sadly. But I think that we still have a long way of struggle and education, educating the Mizrahi population and Ashkenazi too, before we actually get to somewhere that cooperation can be fulfilled massively and not just in activist pockets, radical activist pockets here and there. So I'm afraid that I'm not that optimistic.
Thanks, Orly. We have a few more questions coming in. Let's stick on this theme while we're here. So this is for Orly, but also for Yasser and Gilad. If you have thoughts on this, it's about the intersection of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi issues with class. So the question is, I appreciate your comments to Orly on racism within the Ashkenazi-dominated left. Even the rising Mizrahi middle class still experiences racism and concrete barriers. But it strikes me that historically, the people most harmed by Ashkenazi elite politics, in addition to Palestinians, are low income. I was wondering if you could speak to how the Mizrahi race intersects with classism and what you think the Israeli left is doing to offer an alternative to economic inequality. And so let's hear from everyone if you want to share on this, but maybe let's start with Orly.
It's true that there is a lot of intersection between ethnicity and class for obvious reasons. I mean, if you're discriminated against because of your ethnicity or your nationality, then it is translated into the class in which you find yourself. But I would be hesitant about making that identification between Mizrahim and class issues for two reasons. One, which was mentioned in the question itself, there is an emerging of Mizrahi middle class and even middle upper class. Again, as I mentioned earlier, mostly or significantly in the settlements in the West Bank. So that becomes less and less clear or dominant, that identification between ethnicity and class. But I would also, I'm hesitant about that because I think that looking at the Mizrahi issue only as a class thing is missing layers of discrimination, and that relates to my work as a translator. I think that the cultural discrimination and the cultural erasing and marginalization is not necessarily reflected in terms of class, but they are deadlier sometimes, because when you erase the culture of a community, you break its backbone, and then it's very easy to look at it as dust, as nothing. If you have culture, you have no identity, and then you can be treated as dust. And that is no less dangerous to me than class issues. So it's not, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily link between the two things.
Thanks, Orly. Yasser, Gilad, do you want to share thoughts on this?
No, I'd like to say briefly to join what Orly said, and I think we're often tempted to think about the overlap between the Mizrahi issue and the class issue and find magical solutions for it. Like saying the only way to draw the Mizrahim into the left is to address socioeconomic issues and, you know, make them more wealthy and, you know, less, you know, worried about the cost of living. And I think it's just bad for the left because it really doesn't work like that. There's the power of the right, and we've seen it for decades now, starting with Begin and even more so now with Netanyahu. And as Orly said earlier, there couldn't be a better poster boy of the Ashkenazi elite in Israel than Netanyahu. Yet he comes across very convincingly as the only authentic representative of the Mizrahi underclass. And, you know, to any critical observer, it's just mad to watch, yet it is so incredibly effective. And I think that, you know, by looking at the class issue and making the whole politics classist, we might fall into the same trap as, I don't know, Trotskyites did back in the day, and maybe to this day, like saying, okay, the only way to address politics is, you know, what the superstructure is by the base, you know, boring Marxist lingo. And I think that, you know, that's part of the reason why Marxist politics failed so spectacularly, because they, you know, refused to see how out of sync reality was with their dogma, with their theory. And I think that, you know, it might come across as defeatist, what I'm saying, right? It's, you know, or fatalistic, right? There's nothing to be done. The Mizrahi underclass will forever remain, you know, supporting of the current structure of Jewish supremacy because it benefits them. It does, certainly. But I think that our role as activists, and maybe as, you know, I wouldn't like to say thought leaders, but people who are dealing with ideas, is to find those little exit points where this overarching paradigm doesn't exactly fit the formula, and there might be an opening for other things. But I think that, you know, it would require of us to think outside the box, which I think the Mizrahi equals lower class is really the box in a nutshell.
Let me ask, thanks for that, Gilad. And let me ask Yasser a similar question about Palestinian citizens of Israel, because I think you encounter a similar discourse sometimes that says, you know, if we just pump money into Palestinian citizens of Israel, into those communities, then, you know, maybe we won't have to deal with what Yasser is talking about, the history of 18 years of military rule. We won't have to talk about the institutionalized discrimination. I'm curious, what do you think about that discourse? What is in your view, the right way to talk about the intersection of class and culture when it comes to Palestinian citizens of Israel?
Well, I agree with what Orly said about mixing between the class and the erasing of the culture. It's very connected, because also the issue of erasing the Mizrahi culture is connected for being Arab culture, very Arab culture. And it was also the same methods on the Palestinian side, erasing the culture and erasing the identity. And in the same way, there is also the issues of the class. Yeah, the class, like most of the Palestinian society is really in a very bad situation, especially now in the pandemic. It's even worse. And to think what would happen except of pumping budgets. I think you should, first of all, it's about racism, as Orly said. The state should stop being racist and treating its citizens as fools. And to think only about giving money as a solution. It's not a solution. Like Benjamin Netanyahu was thinking that money solves all the problems. Then 1 month ago, he decides to give every Israeli citizen something like 750 shekels, about $200, a little bit less, everyone. As what? What problem money solves? Okay. As I said before, we should think for the long term. Stop being racist state and treating people as humans. To think about how do you repair the problems that you made in your bare hands. You made a very bad thing, putting people in jail for 18 years and then taking them to your civil life. Every person that goes out of jail goes to a program for after being jailed, how to get to the new life. And now it's about one person. And now I'm talking about a big community that this did not happen to it. Okay, then you should think, how do you treat this wound and think for the long term with the society, with the people who want to make the change, with the civil movements, with the civil organizations. But this does not happen. The only channel for the government is talking with the municipality leaders and chairmen, and these bodies by themselves are badly managed, and many of them are corrupted. Not only the Arabs, all the system. You have money corrupted people who lead big cities in Israel. Not only Arabs, corrupted. There is a big management problem that begins in the head and going down to the other levels. And this affects also the Palestinian community. So moving forward in the state as a whole piece needs to be one thing. It's Balfour, it's making the change. And there is another thing that you need to think about the Palestinian community. Okay, we have many violence. We have drug dealing. We have organized crime and taking protection money from businesses, and it's not dealt. It's not happening almost in the Jewish cities and places. Okay, it's not happening. But in the Arab places and the mixed cities also, it's happening because the police is not dealing with this. They don't give enough budgets to make a long-term program of dealing. There is a talking now about a new deal that one of the joint list members from the Islamic movement who is trying to bring a new program of fighting the violence and cleaning the Arab society from illegal weapons that we have a lot. Like just 3 days ago, a teacher who was preparing for the new year of the schools that began yesterday. Me, myself, I'm a teacher in a primary school also. She was preparing for the beginning of the year. She went back home on the 31st of August to her children to prepare them food. There was a fight in her neighborhood. Okay, she lives in a mixed city called Ramle, in an Arab neighborhood. There was a shooting between the people. Okay, people shooting one on the other, and one bullet went into her kitchen window and killed her one day before going to the school. And the world is not collapsing. She is a teacher in the Israeli system, in the state system. She's a state employee. And no one is talking about this. You understand what's that? So it's a whole change. It's a big change that we need to make it. And talking about, and excuse me for being a little bit long, but talking about the joint list and making a change in a collaboration. I think as Orly said also, it's a like Ayman Ode is the leader of Hadash party, and he is the leader of the joint list as a whole, that is represented by four very different parties who united in order to fight the possibility of being kicked out of the Knesset if they run separately. So they said, okay, in order to continue representing the Arab Palestinians, we need to be united. But now there is, again, a little bit talking, maybe something will happen. There are many issues that they don't agree on, and it's not really very, very stable. So thinking about unity, I'm not sure this will be in the period. So.
Thanks, Yasser. So let's close with this. We have a question. I always like to close with something future-looking and as optimistic as we can get. So we have a question that says, we hear a lot that the left is weak, but judging from these protests, from this panel, from reading 972, it's really strong and prepared to take power. In this light, if Israel was a podcast, who would be the hosts of the program? So I want to close, and as we know, Gilad is a podcast host extraordinaire. I've been meaning to find a good moment to plug the excellent conversation in January between Gilad and Orly on the Tel Aviv Review. And
Dalia Shandlin, who's the co-host of the Tel Aviv Review as well.
Thank you, Gilad. Didn't mean to exclude Dalia there. So take a look at that, put the Tel Aviv Review in your podcast list. So with that, I'd like to end by going around and having each of you tell us who should host the podcast. And let me create these rules for this question. You can give us an individual or an organization, and something we haven't said explicitly in this program, but for most folks tuning in are in the States. We're not involved with the day-to-day efforts of building the sorts of movements that we're talking about, but many people support organizations. They want to know what sort of organizations they can be involved in supporting, and whose work that they should follow. So maybe everyone go around, and who hosts this podcast, so it can be an individual or an organization. Maybe let's try to keep it to 3 or 4, and let's start with Yasser.
Okay. No, try someone else. I want to think a little bit about this question.
Okay, who wants to go first?
Gilad, you go.
Yeah, okay, I'll go first. I'm not sure it really answers the question, but I'll just say, just talking about a podcast or a radio show reminded me of a radio show that I think is pretty unusual for the Israeli media. What I like to see, like the people I find hope in, are those not necessarily that I agree with 100%. Sometimes I disagree with them entirely, but these people who have shown an ability to transcend party lines and go against their own organization or camp or group of people, you know, anti-populist really, even in the most, you know, narrow sense, just, you know, people of principle. And there's a radio show that I currently pretty new on the Israeli national radio that is hosted by two such people that I never, both former politicians that I never voted for. And I disagree with much of the politics, but I think that they are free-thinking people. And this is a show co-hosted by Shelley Yachimowicz, who was the leader of the Labour Party for a while and stood down before one of the elections last year, and Igal Guetta, who was a Knesset member for Shas, so he's a Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox man, who was kicked out of his own party because he attended the gay wedding of a relative of his. So this is really, you know, for an ultra-Orthodox man, a really brave thing to do, and, you know, for liberal people, really a badge of honor. And I don't know if I'd let either of them be the podcast host of the Israel podcast, but they're definitely really refreshing in the sense that they're transcending those, you know, I started by saying that Israeli politics is really compartmentalized, and they have no problem, and they're even proud of it. They're even proud of saying things that are really anathema to their own followers. And I think that the future of politics and the future of Israeli politics lies there.
Thanks, Galam. Orly, who hosts your podcast?
Oh, well, not Ashkenazi Jewish men to start with.
Not a general. Yeah.
No. And for that matter, not Ashkenazi women either. My ultimate podcast would be hosted. I think if I think about the main points that I want to see in my host, I think about ideological backbone. I think about truly democratic vision. And most of all, I think about courage. And the two women fit that description most for me, that I would love to see them hosting the Israeli podcasts are Hanin Zobi, the first one, which was, she was for 10 years Knesset member of Balad, probably the most delegitimized, incited against politician ever serving in the Israeli Knesset. She suffered tons of racism, misogyny, violence, persecution, and she maintained with her head held up high and represented the most democratic vision I've ever came across in the Israeli politics. So Hanin Zobi is one, and the other is Shula Keshet, a Mizrahi phenomenal social political activist. She founded the Mizrahi feminist organization of Achoti, which means my sister, in the deprived southern Tel Aviv. And she works with Palestinian communities, asylum seekers communities, Mizrahi communities. I think it's about time that, we promoted those sorts of feminist, non-Ashkenazi, courageous democratic voices.
Thanks, Orly. Great. Yasser?
Well, now I feel very happy now because I know what to say. And are we finishing now?
We are. Yeah, we're wrapping up.
Okay, so I will not talk long. I would say that I was very lucky several months ago to work as an editor, lingual editor, for one of the most important documentary historical series ever made in Israel in the last 3,000 years. It's called A Lesson about Homeland. And it was made by some guy. He's like a commentator, sport commentator, famous in Israel. His name is Modi Baron. And he worked together with another director. Her name is Anat Zeltzer. But the editor of the series, that is compounded of six episodes of 30 minutes, talking about what happened in the last 150 years, actually, that brought us to this day. Scientific people, researchers, good thinking, balanced. You see the picture in a clear way. Also Jewish people, also Arabs. It's very important. I was working on the translation of the Arabic subtitles. And the editor of this series is my friend, and she really answers the criteria that my dearest friend Orly Noy mentioned before. Her name is Tammy Riklis. And I think that she, together with my friend Orly, without you, Gilad, we don't need you. Only Orly and Tammy will make a podcast and interview my grandmother and talk about everything, especially about food.
Good. Thanks, Yasser. Yasser, Orly, Gilad, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really wonderful conversation. For everyone who joined, thank you for our questions. I just want to highlight that all three of these thinkers and writers and activists are working with independent media in Israel, which is so important to support. And I think so many of us in the States rely on that independent media and otherwise would have no way of following and engaging with what's happening. So look up all the organizations that they write for. I'll just highlight two, which is 972 Magazine and the Tel Aviv Review of Books. So please look these up online, support them. They rely on your donations.
It's not fair, Sam. It's not fair. It's not fair. Not only 972. Okay, I'm in 972 and Tel Aviv. What about Hawkins?
Yasser and Hawkins. And I apologize, Yasser. So yeah, please support Hawkins as well. I'll send all three out there in the chat. Yasser, I thought you were a board member of 972. I thought I was doing good there. I apologize.
It's okay. We are friends. We are friends.
So please support all of the independent media. And of course, the same is true for Extend. We're a nonprofit. We rely entirely on your support. So please go to extendprograms.org and make a donation. Thank you so much for joining. It has been live on Facebook. We'll send it out by email and post it on Facebook. Please share with family and friends. And again, Orly, Yasser, Gilad, thank you so much for joining us.